Kagame's Cognitive Dissonance. Written by Gabriel Ndayishimiye. Calling donors idiots while still gleefully pocketing their money is the pinnacle of performative defiance. Not just cracks in the facade, but a full-blown implosion of credibility. Kagame positions himself as the Lion of Africa, roaring defiantly against foreign meddling. But let's be clear, this roaring is financed by the very people he mocks. It's beyond a paradox. It's theater. The dependency he decries is not an unfortunate necessity. It's an exploited tool. Biting the hand that feeds you might seem rebellious, but when you ensure that hand keeps feeding, it becomes a spectacle of calculated hypocrisy. This isn't merely a flaw in the system. It's the system dressed up in the language of sovereignty and resistance to distract from its foundational inequities. Let's not dance around the absurdity. Kagame's rhetoric isn't about actual independence. It's a carefully crafted performance aimed at internal audiences and regional approval. His critiques of donor influence, framed as bold stands against neo-colonialism, resonate widely but serve to mask deeper contradictions. While railing against imperialist meddling, Kagame's government has entrenched a system where foreign aid props up the very mechanisms of control that deepen inequality and maintain elite privilege. This is not just dependency. It is an intentional strategy to exploit donor funds while perpetuating authoritarian rule under the guise of sovereignty. This dual narrative doesn't expose sovereignty as a principle, but as a tool for deflection. The house Kagame claims to have built on sovereignty still rests on foreign bricks, raising a critical question. Is this sovereignty, or is it a facade designed to pacify both domestic audiences and foreign donors? Kagame's spectacle of strength is a calculated performance, where the contradiction isn't accidental but deliberate, projecting independence while ensuring dependency thrives unnoticed. If sovereignty is merely an illusion sustained by foreign aid, who truly benefits from this arrangement, and at what cost to Rwanda's future? This manipulation of aid, functioning simultaneously as a development tool and a mechanism for authoritarian consolidation, exposes the stark contradiction between Kagame's rhetoric and his actions. While loudly criticizing Western interference, his regime systematically relies on their financial support to reinforce a centralized power structure and marginalize opposition. This isn't just hypocrisy. It's calculated exploitation of a system where donors, fearing instability, become complicit in sustaining the very authoritarianism they might otherwise oppose. The tragedy is not only in the perpetuation of this cycle, but in the betrayal of those who believe Kagame's performance of sovereignty and reform is genuine. Timothy Longman reminds us that Kagame's entire recovery narrative, this heroic tale of Rwanda's rise from the ashes, is itself a double-edged sword. Sure, it's brought in the goodwill and the cash, but it's also locked Rwanda into a dependency cycle. The very story Kagame uses to assert his nation's strength is the same story that keeps it reliant on donor benevolence. Every time Kagame lambasts his donors, it's like watching someone bite into a lemon and pretend it's candy. You can't look away from the absurdity. The geopolitical spin is no less laughable. The accolades Rwanda receives often mask its reliance on donor funding and the authoritarian control underpinning its governance. Rwanda's dependency isn't just economic, it's systemic. Kagame's rhetoric might fool some into thinking the lion has tamed the hunters, but the hunters still control the cage. His posturing as a peer to the global powers is theater, and like all theater, it relies on an audience willing to suspend disbelief. Psychologically, Leon Festinger's theory of cognitive dissonance captures Kagame's dilemma perfectly. The more he touts sovereignty, the louder he has to shout to drown out the reality of dependency. It's a self-perpetuating spiral. This isn't just about reconciling contradictions, it's about survival. Kagame's rhetoric serves as a pressure valve, releasing the tension of an unsustainable position without actually changing it. Even when viewed through the lens of development critiques, Kagame's position falls apart. While he promotes the rhetoric of economic reform and self-reliance, the reality is far less transformative. Investments in domestic industries such as agriculture, renewable energy, and technology are often tailored to serve the interests of foreign donors and investors, rather than addressing the structural inequities within Rwanda itself. For instance, large-scale agricultural projects frequently prioritize export markets over local food security, leaving the average citizen disconnected from the supposed benefits. Similarly, investments in renewable energy often cater to multinational corporations seeking profit, rather than expanding affordable access to rural communities. Moreover, fostering regional trade agreements and strengthening intra-African partnerships, while potentially valuable, is continually undermined by Kagame's frequent entanglements in conflicts with neighboring countries. These wars not only drain resources but also stoke regional instability, making meaningful economic integration a distant goal. Combined with Kagame's preference for maintaining a centralized and elite-driven economic model, these efforts remain largely symbolic, designed more to appease international investors than to address systemic dependency. Without a shift away from militarized regional policies and genuine redistribution of wealth or empowerment of local producers, these so-called reforms function as little more than window dressing. Dambisa Moyo's disdain for aid dependency might resonate with some of Kagame's rhetoric, but Kagame fails to embrace her more radical calls for creating truly independent economies. His government offers no meaningful departure from existing global aid paradigms, instead embedding itself deeper within a system that reinforces dependency. William Easterly's critiques of traditional aid models further expose this trap. Kagame's simultaneous reliance on and critique of donors is not revolutionary, it's a calculated performance. For instance, Kagame regularly touts Rwanda's status as a beacon of progress, using high-profile initiatives like Vision 2050 and infrastructure projects funded by donor money to project an image of success. Yet these same initiatives often serve donor interests, prioritizing international recognition over addressing domestic inequality. How does Kagame intend to deliver on Vision 2050 when Vision 2020 failed to meet its most transformative promises? This duality, a carefully curated external image and internal realities of control, reveals how deeply Kagame's leadership relies on managing perceptions rather than enacting systemic change. His leadership does not challenge the underlying mechanisms of exploitation, but perpetuates them, wrapped in a veneer of progressive reform. Infrastructure projects funded by donors may transform Kigali's skyline, but they rarely address systemic poverty or empower rural communities, exposing the disparity between the rhetoric of reform and the realities on the ground. So what does Kagame's cognitive dissonance tell us? That sovereignty, as he sells it, is a myth, crafted to shield the deeper entrenchment of dependency and exploitation. This myth operates not just as a rhetorical tool, but as a mechanism to obscure the ways in which donor interests dictate the flow of capital and power in Rwanda. By critiquing the global system without challenging its foundational inequities, Kagame reinforces the very structures he claims to oppose, leaving the system intact while performing defiance for a global audience. That his rhetoric isn't a bold critique of the global system, but a desperate attempt to reconcile irreconcilable contradictions. Kagame's approach doesn't offer a solution to the paradox of dependency. It wallows in it, dressing it up in the language of resistance. The tragedy isn't that the idiot calls his donors idiots. The tragedy is that the donors keep paying him to do it. Donors, driven by strategic interests, become complicit in sustaining the authoritarian structures Kagame uses their aid to reinforce. Kagame's approach doesn't offer a bold critique of the global system. It exploits it, leveraging dependency while projecting an illusion of defiance.